Chapter 1. The Aegean Sea. I will always remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard that my father had died. I was lying naked in the sun on the deck of the Neptune, with Theo's hand resting protectively on my stomach. The deserted curve of golden beach on the island in front of us glimmered in the sun as it sat nestled in its rocky cove. The crystal-clear turquoise water was making a lazy attempt at foaming waves as it hit the sands, foaming elegantly like the froth on a cappuccino. Becalmed, I'd thought. Like me. We'd dropped anchor in the small bay off the tiny Greek island of Macheres at sunset the night before, then waded ashore to the cove, carrying 2 cool boxes. One was filled with fresh red mullet and sardines that Theo had caught earlier that day, the other with wine and water. I'd set down my load on the sand, panting with effort, and Theo had kissed my nose tenderly. "We are castaways on our very own desert island," he'd announced, spreading his arms wide to gesture at the idyllic setting. "Now, I'm off in search of firewood so we can cook our fish." I'd watched him as he turned from me and walked towards the rocks forming a crescent around the cove, heading for the tinder-dry sparse bushes that grew in the crevices. Given he was a world-class sailor, his slight frame belied his strength. Compared to the other men I crewed with in sailing competitions, who seemed to be all rippling muscles and Tarzan-like chests, Theo was positively diminutive. One of the first things I'd noticed about him was his rather lopsided gait. He'd since told me how he'd broken his ankle falling out of a tree as a child, and how it had never mended properly. I suppose it's another reason why I was always destined for a life on the water. When I'm sailing, no one can tell how ridiculous I look walking on land, he'd chuckled. We'd cooked our fish, and later made love under the stars. The following morning was our last aboard together. And just before I'd decided I absolutely had to resume contact with the outside world by switching on my mobile, and then subsequently discovered my life had shattered into a million tiny pieces, I'd lain there next to him, perfectly at peace. And, like a surreal dream, my mind had replayed the miracle of Theo and me, and how we'd come to be here in this beautiful place. I'd first set eyes on him a year or so ago, at the Heineken Regatta in St. Martin in the Caribbean. The winning crew was celebrating at the victory dinner, and I was intrigued to discover that their skipper was Theophilus Kings. He was a celebrity in the sailing world, having steered more crews to victory in offshore races during the past 5 years than any other captain. "He isn't what I imagined at all," I commented under my breath to Rob Bellamy, an old crewmate with whom I'd sailed for the Swiss national team. "He looks like a geek with those horn-rimmed glasses," I added, as I watched him stand up to move across to another table. "And he has a very odd walk." "He's certainly not your average brawny sailor, admittedly," agreed Rob. "But Al, the guy is a total genius. He has a sixth sense when it comes to the water, and there's no one I'd trust more as my skipper on stormy seas." I was introduced to Theo briefly by Rob later that evening, and I noticed his hazel-flecked green eyes were thoughtful as he shook my hand. "So you're the famous Al Dapliez." Behind his British accent, his voice was warm and steady. "Yes, to the latter part of that statement," I said, embarrassed at the compliment. "But I think it's you who's famous." Doing my best not to let my gaze waver under his continued scrutiny, I saw his features soften as he let out a chuckle. "What's so funny?" I demanded. "To be frank, I wasn't expecting you." "What do you mean, me?" Thea's attention was diverted by a photographer wanting a team photo, so I never did get to hear what it was he meant. After that, I began to notice him across the room at various social events for the regattas we took part in. He had an indefinable vibrancy about him.